So we're going to get started. My name is Nina Avenal. I am a program manager here at IEA. If you are new to us, welcome. If you are returning, thank you for continuing to support the Gifted Support Group meetings by attending them. If you're new to IEA, so IEA has been serving the needs of gifted children for the past 20 years, and we specifically developed these Gifted Support Group meetings so that parents and educators of gifted children have a safe and open forum to share their experiences and also learn from experts. This evening, this is actually our first Gifted Support Group meeting for the school year, and we have an amazing lineup of speakers and topics that we are excited to share with parents and also educators. And so without further ado, I do want to introduce Michelle Bodwell, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist and also a board certified art therapist, who will be sharing parenting the self-compassion way. So, Michelle.
Thank you. So, good evening. Good to see you all here. Thank you for coming tonight. One other piece of my bio that I'd like to add is I'm also a parent of gifted and 2E children, 2 sons, both teenagers. Officially, just one turned a teenager just this past weekend. So I'm kind of full throng in the middle school, high school years. So what we're going to be talking about tonight is parenting the self-compassion way. And some of us were having a little bit of dialogue earlier, and we were talking about how a lot of things that we deal with as parents, it begins with us. And so in that spirit, we're going to be really tuning into our own needs tonight and our own way of treating ourselves and how that affects not only our well-being, but our child's as well. So in the spirit of compassion, I want to share with you a story that just happened this morning. So I was driving my 13-year-old son to school, and I was telling him like what was going to be happening today, you know, and who was going to be picking him up and the schedule, and he's actually going to be trying out water polo for the first time tonight. So I was kind of giving him everything, and I was telling him I'm doing this talk tonight, and telling him I'm feeling a little bit nervous. I still need to work on my talk, and I clients to see, and a busy day. And he said to me, he said, Mom, let me see, I wrote it down here. He said, Mom, it's okay, we all make mistakes. And in a few hours, they won't even remember what the mistakes were that you made, and they'll just remember the good talk that you gave them. So I love that. And he didn't even realize that I was talking tonight about compassion. And so then I was telling him like, wow, that really just goes perfectly with the talk that I'm going to be giving. So we have so much to learn from our children. So I wanted for you to think about what prompted you to come here tonight. And this, we can kind of just open forum on this. I'd love to hear about what were people interested in the topic. Had you heard about self-compassion before? So does anyone have anything to share?
Well, I feel like I can't understand my son when he's overly emotional over little things that I think are little.
Right.
And I'm thinking, why are you building a mountain out of a molehill? Like I'm constantly thinking that. Yeah. I have to understand it from his point of view, or we're going to fight all the time. Okay. So that's why I decided. Okay. To do this one.
Yeah. So being able to see something from another person's perspective.
I think too, with gifted kids, I have 3 also, and I think of those years, those junior year, high and high school years, you're just surviving. It's like, what fire are you going to put out next? What craziness is going to happen?
Yes, absolutely.
And where do you get totally lost in the yourself and taking care of yourself? You're just going automatic, and then all of a sudden something happens and you realize you've got to do something to take care of yourself, but you don't do it proactively. So that I think the idea of self-compassion is like, that's even like a foreign language. Right.
Or it seems like a luxury.
Right.
Right.
Like a spa day or whatever, it's like who has time or money.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a very common experience. I think you guys both highlighted some of the uniqueness of raising gifted children is the intensity, the emotional intensity, and how, again, we're trying to have compassion and understand that in our children, but then being able to have compassion with ourselves and say, wow, this is really hard. And maybe this doesn't really match up with the vision that I had for, when I thought about having children. You know, I think none of us like really go into that with like, this is what it's going to be like. But we know when we get there and it's like, you know, and it's like this, that this isn't what we thought it was going to be. And so I think that's why this topic is especially important for all parents, but I think especially for us as gifted parents, because it is important. And again, this idea of like, you know, we need to, this, whatever we do is inside out, you know, and so we have to attune to ourselves, and we have to first grow these things in us so that then we can in turn help our child and help grow and foster these things in them. So that's kind of like the premise of tonight, what we're going to be talking about. And again, I'm confident that every one of you here, did we get the live screen going, or if there's people, okay, I was like, well, if there's people out there in cyberland, but any of you, all of you here are, I'm sure that you have been and are very dedicated parents, you know, doing everything you can to meet your child's intellectual, academic, emotional, physical, spiritual, relational, you know, needs. But this is a night that we're going to turn and tune into ourselves. And what is it that we need? And again, it feels like maybe a little bit of a paradigm shift, maybe a little bit about like, I'm just trying to survive, or I'm just trying to help my child survive. But again, I think that this concept can actually be very helpful in attending to those questions or those needs. So we want to talk a little bit about what is self-compassion. And this was kind of a newer concept to me. I'm in the process of finishing up my certification to be a Daring Way facilitator with Brené Brown. Some of you may have heard of her. And so when I first started doing that training, doing an initial training a couple years ago, is when I first kind of got introduced to this concept of self-compassion. You know, what is this? And but I think first, to understand compassion, we have to really get comfortable with talking about suffering. And I don't know for most of you, but I think talking about suffering and pain isn't very comfortable for most of us, and it's certainly very countercultural. I think so much of our cultural context is like numbing pain or escaping pain, or, you know, being distracted away from pain and suffering. But to be compassionate people, whether it's to ourselves or others, we have to really understand and get on the ground with suffering. Compassion actually means to feel with or to suffer with another person. That's a pretty powerful definition. You know, when we give compassion to another person, it's recognizing their pain, their suffering, whether it's another person, or sometimes we are moved to compassion by seeing an injured animal or a situation like that. You know, sometimes we see on the news destruction or you know, natural disasters and things like that, and we see the loss, we see the pain, and we're prompted to want to do something. We want to respond. We want to try to alleviate that kind of pain. So compassion cannot exist without the presence of suffering or failure or mistakes. Otherwise, we'd just be offering them pity. And that's very different from what compassion is. So again, compassion means being able to see something from another person's viewpoint, trying to experience that pain, you know, and then wanting to move towards alleviating that or helping it. Compassionate responses rarely include something that's critical or judgmental. You know, if somebody had a loss, you wouldn't say, well, you know, you shouldn't have gotten yourself into that. Or, you know, if an animal is in the middle of the road, you wouldn't say, well, they shouldn't have crossed the road. You know, those would be very like critical or judgmental statements about the state of that situation. And the other important piece is recognizing that all of us suffer as human beings. Like, that is part of a shared human condition. We all fail. We all make mistakes. So having compassion for yourself is just like having compassion for another person. Self-compassion is first being able to recognize our own suffering, big or small. You know, I think a lot of times we're very used to brushing off something. Oh, well, that's, you know, I'll be okay, or it's not that big of a deal. And so we minimize, or we brush off, you know, a pain or a suffering. And it's really about recognizing that all of that is important. All of that needs acceptance. and responding to ourselves with the same level of care or kindness, acceptance or comfort that we would another person. Self-compassion is really about honoring and accepting our humanness, which includes like limitations, our mistakes, or our suffering. And this is the reality about being human. And again, this is something that we share in together. So self-compassion really begins with the mindset that as humans, we're all flawed and broken. We all are able to experience pain and suffering, and we're all able to be kind in response to that and accept, and then be in a place of acceptance of that. And that means ourselves as well. So before we get further into specifically what self-compassion is, I want to talk about why it's important for our well-being. So it's like I'm already starting off with suffering, and it's like, wow, this isn't really a good start here. But I'm gonna give you a little bit of information that I think might help you if you're a little bit of a skeptic about it. So over the past decade, there's been a lot more research that's been going on about self-compassion. And the results have been consistently showing a positive correlation with self-compassion and psychological well-being, with greater emotional resilience, which is essential for dealing with any of life's troubles or just day-to-day life. We need resilience. Greater social connectedness, which is something I think that we're needing more and more in our technology-driven culture that's kind of eliminating a lot of that. Curiosity and exploration, which as a creative, artistic person is something that I think is really important for creativity. And then just overall life satisfaction. And then if those weren't convincing enough, it has also had a positive correlation with less anxiety, depression, shame, and fear of failure, less reactive anger, less narcissistic focus on ourselves, and then it can also help us make real changes in our lives. And again, as a therapist and as somebody that's working with people that often have like anxiety or depression, or that come because they want to make life changes, oftentimes, the way that they view themselves or the way that they're treating themselves is a key component to whether those outcomes change or not. So, and then there's also been a lot of other studies that have talked about like the positive impact on just our bodies, our bodies feeling better and being healthy, and our brain chemistry, improving. And again, all of those things that, we can breathe better physical health as well as mental health. So one of the leading researchers in self-compassion is Kristen Neff. And she's a great website. I put it on your handout. And it's selfcompassion.org, and there's a lot of great resources that I'll tell you about later. But she defines self-compassion existing with 3 essential components. And the first one is, and these are all listed on your handout as well on the top, self-kindness versus self-judgment. So this means that we take a warm and understanding being warm and understanding towards ourselves when we suffer or when we fail or when we feel inadequate. Rather than ignoring our pain or beating ourselves up with self-criticism. And this can take the shape of how we view ourselves, how we view the circumstances of our lives, or it could be our inner voice. One of the common areas that I, again, often help clients with is recognizing and taming their own inner critic. As human beings, we tend to be the most critical with ourselves. I heard one speaker talk about that as we go out in kind of concentric rings, from ourselves, we get more and more compassionate and kind. So we're like the most compassionate towards a stranger, but the most critical and judgmental towards ourselves. And sometimes we might tell ourselves that we wouldn't dare to tell another person, especially somebody that's close to us. So things like, you're not good enough, you're a loser, what an idiot, I can't believe you did that, I think are really common things that we often find ourselves, saying to ourselves. This critical voice is often laced with shame, which tears down the very core of ourselves, leading us to believe that we're not worthy of love and belonging. And I'll talk a little bit more in a second about shame. So in researching this topic of self-compassion, I ran across this wonderful story of a little 3-year-old girl who referred to herself as little sweetie. And her mother would hear her going around the house saying, it's okay, little sweetie, you're tired, you need a nap. It's okay, little sweetie, you're hungry, you need some strawberries. Or she would say to her mom, little sweetie's sad, she needs a hug. And I think this was marvelous of how this little girl at age 3 knew no other way to refer to herself than with this loving, kind response. Nothing in life or no one had ever shown her or spoken to her in a way that would be contrary to her speaking to herself that way. So I found this so moving that I actually was telling myself and using this in my own life. And so I would, if I was in a hard situation, I would say, little sweetie, this is really hard. little sweetie, and it was like I instantly kind of had that very, nurturing self of like seeing myself as like a little child and like going, nobody ever like asks for this or nobody ever like thinks that this is going to happen. And just like, it's like really taking note of yourself. And I was so moved by doing this. I think I even may have verbalized it out loud because I think one of my sons heard me and he was like, little sweetie. But I think this idea of doing this, I was literally almost moved to tears by just the sheer kindness of calling myself an endearing term. So the next point that Kristen Neff says that's part of self-compassion is common humanity versus isolation. So, and again, it's the reality that all human beings suffer. The very definition of being human means that we are mortal, vulnerable, and imperfect. So therefore, self-compassion involves recognizing that suffering and personal inadequacy is part of our shared human experience. Your inadequacy might be different than mine, but again, like we all share in that together. There's not one of us that escapes that. And again, this is this idea of when we can see it as a shared thing, it removes us from isolating and saying, well, it's isolation, it's me alone. Like I'm the only one that's dealing with this. I'm the only one that, has this pain or made this mistake. So I want you to, if you're willing to be vulnerable, raise your hand if you've ever been, less than patient with your child and maybe raised your voice more than you would have liked to. So, and again, that's something that as parents, we often have a lot of guilt about, or even shame about. But again, this is part of just as parents in our subset that we have a shared common humanity around. And again, the more that we can be open and vulnerable in admitting that to ourselves, and we're able to join with others around that too. And I don't want to minimize the fact that sometimes there are situations that are very unique or rare that we find ourselves in. And this doesn't mean like, oh, everything's, it's all global. But I think that there usually is an element in there of something that we can find a commonality around. And then the third part of self-compassion is mindfulness over identification. So mindfulness is being in a non-judgmental, receptive state where we can be observant of our thoughts, our feelings, just as they are, not judging them, just recognizing them, without trying to suppress them or deny them. We can't ignore our pain and feel compassion for it at the same time. Those are mutually exclusive. And at the same time, mindfulness requires that we don't over-identify with those thoughts and feelings so that we get caught up and swept away by a negative reactivity around it. And so the mindfulness, oftentimes mindfulness can be an elusive term. Sometimes it might feel like it is only synonymous with like a meditation practice or something like that. But to me, mindfulness is being aware, is practicing awareness, of myself, recognizing what's going on for me, what am I feeling today? Sensations in my body, emotional feelings, what my thoughts are, what I'm telling myself, what my reactions are maybe to certain circumstances, especially with my kids, I probably get triggered or activated, multiple times a day by something my children do or don't do, or something that I want them to do or that they're not doing or whatever. But it's really important that instead of just trying to manage or shut down their behavior, I got to realize what's going on with me first. And I have to be attuned to, why is this such a trigger for me? Do I have expectations for my child that maybe are unrealistic for them, or really more about me than it is about them? But that all comes from a mindful awareness and studying myself, knowing myself. And again, the more that we're able to be mindful and be aware of ourselves, then the more that we're going to be able to practice compassion. Again, and it begins with us and then moves outward. So some of the differences. So sometimes when people hear self-compassion, they think, well, isn't that like just feeling sorry for yourself? Well, that would be self-pity. And the difference between that is kind of wallowing in a poor me kind of attitude. It's more of that isolation mentality of not seeing it as a shared experience, as a common humanity, but seeing it as a just me. It's maybe thinking negatively or staying in that negative place. Another thing people might think self-compassion is, just doing a bunch of great stuff for yourself, like, oh, you worked hard and so you can go buy that thing, or you did this and so go have that, food or drink item that, you want to have. That's more self-indulgent, again, like just, maybe not one, but like, it's not just about rewarding yourself, or giving yourself nice things. This is more about the way of your attitude towards yourself, your treatment of yourself. And not that those things aren't good and positive and in good doses, but it may not touch on the same place of acceptance and nurturing and recognizing the pain, or recognizing the flaws or the imperfections. They may be just a cover over them. And then too, I think that we hear a lot about self-care, and I think self-care is, again, a really important thing, but I think that self-compassion is different in that self-care can be, there's a lot of great things that we can do that are self-care. Somebody mentioned the spa day. We can go to the spa and nurture ourselves that way, but we might still go home and berate ourselves for something else. So we might be practicing great self-care, but not great self-compassion. And so it's really important that we have a balanced view of how do we take care of ourselves? What do we truly need? And how do we go about doing that in a way that's showing kindness to the essence of who we are? So I'll pause there and see if there's any questions so far.
It's not a question, but I was just thinking of that sometimes I'll do like what I think is a self-care activity and then feel guilty about it later. So that was like in my head a good distinguishing between self-compassion and self-care. Right.
So I think then the self-compassion thing would be to be able to look at that guilt in a non-judgmental stance and say, why do I feel guilty about that? What are the reasons behind that? And be able to tease that out. That's a great question. So we're going to be kind of pausing and doing some little exercises in between the segments. So if you take your hand out in the upper left quadrant, there's some questions that I want you to just take a moment to think about yourself and your own life. Maybe you can pay attention to how you're feeling as a parent right now. Maybe there was even something that happened today or right before you came here where you were feeling in a moment of pain or of even desperation as a parent. What are your sufferings or places of pain? How do you tend to respond to those areas of pain in yourself? Do you acknowledge them and show yourself kindness? Or do you criticize and judge yourself for not having it all together? And what about being able to see the shared humanity in your pain? Does it feel like you're all alone? And are you able to stay mindful and curious about your thoughts and feelings without denying or suppressing them? So I'll just give you maybe about just 30 seconds to reflect on that. And that may have felt comfortable, that may have felt awkward, may have felt revealing. And that's sometimes what happens when we, tune into some of these areas that are hard, that are painful. It might feel uncomfortable, but I think as we get used to that and as we work through that, it can become more comfortable, more second nature for us. So I wanted to talk about now some of the things that can sabotage, our efforts to practicing self-compassion. One of them is the shoulds. How many of you have shoulds in your life? Lots of shoulds. Maybe the shoulds that we have for ourselves. Again, maybe the shoulds that we have for our kids or our family or our, jobs or our partner or, the list can go on and on. I think, but when we can get honest with what our expectations are for ourselves, maybe even specifically as a parent or for our child's behavior or achievements, then we can explore where they've come from and whether they're realistic or not. I've come to realize in myself that the minute I've got resentment or disappointment, I've got to look at my expectations and my boundaries, because something is amiss there. And so whenever I detect those things creeping up in me, I know that I need to reflect and be aware of what's happening for me. If I've overextended myself, or maybe I've not taken care of my own needs adequately, or again, if I have unrealistic expectations for someone else, it's usually a recipe for resentment. Just recently, before a family trip with extended family, I was feeling those waves churning in me. The little bit of stress, the frustration, maybe the beginnings of disappointment. And I was like, okay, I need to check in with this and see what's going on. And I was able to recognize in myself that I had a lot invested in this, that not only had I invested a lot of my time and that I had done the lion's share of the planning and all of that, but that I really wanted this family trip to go well. And so it gave me a moment of recognizing that was a need of mine, that I could just throw it out there in an expectation that I wanted my kids to behave a certain way, or me, or I wanted the circumstances to go well. But instead it was really that I needed, I needed something. So I, pulled everyone together before we left, and I said, look, I just realized that I'm really invested in this, and this is what I need, from you all. And really it was about I want this to be a good experience for all of us. I want us to all show up and be the best that we can be, to be able to roll with the unexpected, to maybe let things go, let things slide, and be more generous with our assumptions about people's motivations or whatever it was going to be. Let's just try to be our best selves on this trip. And it really set the tone. It was really great, first of all, for me to recognize that and maybe realize the places that I needed to let go of some of those expectations, but then also to be able to kind of talk to my family about, my own need and maybe the way that we could all show up together. And it ended up being a great vacation. So another saboteur is shame. And again, when we see ourselves as flawed and not good enough, or a failure, our core worthiness is in jeopardy. And we will inevitably struggle with trying to show ourselves kindness or compassion. So as I mentioned before, Brene Brown, who's a leading researcher with vulnerability and courage and shame, a lot of her hallmark research is around shame. She's defined it that it's the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of acceptance or belonging. And again, these are like core human things that we all deserve to be loved, to belong. And because shame attacks that central place of worth, it's in opposition of kindness and compassion. Another thing that can sabotage is shrinking space. I know for myself that when my schedule goes out, fills to the brim, and I don't leave myself margin or my kids margin, that I'm not the person that I want to be. That it goes directly against my integrity and the way that I want to live my life and the way that I want to parent and all of those things. So I think the more that we don't leave space, there's no room for error. There's no room for reflection or intentional practices. And all of this stuff is really about being intentional, practicing these things in a diligent and thoughtful way. Some of the happiest times of my life have been some of the most simple times. Of different vacations that I've had, like the one where we stayed in like the simple place and we had like the one bag of clothes, and it was just, it was the best time, listening to the rainstorm in the Midwest in the middle of summer and listening to the frogs, play their little banjos, it sounds like, again, it was just the simplicity and the open spaces to be able to do that. And so for me, it's really important, especially as, a parent and a working mom, somebody that's like running my own business, like I have to set my own schedule. So I have to make sure that I carve out that space and honor that rhythm of leaving margin, because that's important to me. And then lastly, the swift speed. And this is similar to the shrinking space, but it's more about when life just is happening. And it's going by so fast that we don't have time to catch our breath. Again, we're not able to be intentional. We're not able to maybe take the time to attune to ourselves. And so when we're able to slow down, we can cultivate patience too. I think so much of our culture is just so immediate and on demand. I recently started brewing kombucha, and I love the fact that I have to wait for it. And it's something that, I'm wanting it right away, and I go and I mark my bottles when I start, and it has to ferment for like 7 to 10 days. And so I have to wait, and then I have to count the days, and I have to say, I've got to wait one more day. But I think it's helping to like slow down the pace of my life, that I have to wait for something, something to age and come to fruition. And I think it's the same for us too. So again, turning to your worksheet on the self-compassion saboteur scale, bottom left, just take a minute to rate yourself on those. And you can interpret the Likert scale however you want. One can be best or the lowest, however you'd like. But look at that and see where you think you are on those 4 saboteurs. And one of those might be something that you feel like, yeah, I'm doing great in that. And there might be another one that says that you might reflect and say, that's one that I can work on. I think a lot of these we're always a work in progress. And I think that's another place of that self-acceptance and saying we never quite master any of these things. We're always working on it. And so sometimes we'll be doing better than other times, and knowing that that's just part of the process. So we're going to talk a little bit about why is this important to parenting? Like, you guys are here, this is a parenting support group. You're thinking, why are we just talking about ourselves? But again, from this inside out perspective, that whatever, we can't lead our children where we haven't gone ourselves, and we can't teach them skills that we don't have ourselves. So one of the things that I really want for my children is for them to be self-accepting, to be able to be compassionate and empathetic, you know, towards others and towards themselves. And I think especially with, you know, young adults, teens, you know, I think the identity piece is so important, and I think it's so critical, especially with so much that's kind of attacking it now in our culture. And so I think there's a lot of young people that do not have a good foundation in how they view themselves. And I think that as parents, if we can really get a grounding on this, then this is something that we can be influencing and sharing with our children, and helping them to develop this practice of self-acceptance and then self-compassion. So I like to think about it in terms of a well. You know, again, like if we need to be filling our well so that we have a place to draw from. And again, I think this isn't not just being able to teach them, but I think being able to handle the day-to-day things that come up, the intensity, you know, the catastrophic, you know, meltdowns and tantrums, like in the middle of the store. Like we need to constantly have a well that is being replenished so that we can dip from that and we have something to offer. And again, I think that's where this, not only this, but then the self-care and the other things, being able to recognize what do we really need to be filling that well. Sometimes it might be meeting physical needs. Sometimes it might be more of the emotional needs, you know, spiritual, relational, you know, intellectual, you know, social needs. We have all those things too. And so thinking about how do we replenish ourselves. A little story about one of those kind of meltdowns was a number of years ago. One of my sons was little, and maybe, you know, toddler age, maybe 3-4 preschool. And we were in Bed Bath & Beyond over here in Pasadena, for those of you who might have been to a big store, huge open aisles, you know, echoing ceilings. And I'm not sure what happened that set him off, but he was not happy, and he was screaming, he was hitting me, he was kicking me. And I was so upset, not only that I was having this happen to me, but I think too, just the embarrassment of like being in this open public place, that I abandoned the cart and ran to the corner of the aisle and got down on the floor and just started sobbing. And he came over, and I think he was so shocked at my reaction. You know, I wasn't getting mad at him, or I wasn't scolding him or trying to, you know, I was just literally in that place of pain. And he was moved to compassion, and he got down on the ground and started sobbing with me. And so we were in this huddle together in the corner on the floor in Bed Bath & Beyond, just sobbing and crying together. And it went on for a while. You know, when you're in those moments, it's like slow motion, but I know even just looking back at it, that it was a while. And somebody came from like the side of the store and saw us in this heap and said, "Ma'am, are you okay?" I don't even think I could respond to him. I may have waved my hand or something. But I think it was one of those moments where it was like, I literally had that, I was able to see my own pain. And in doing that, like my son was able to respond, and we were able to kind of like come together in that moment. But I think it's also one of those things where it's like, you know, maybe at that time, I also didn't have much of a well to draw from. You know, I think that I was probably pretty depleted, and that's why I was like reduced to a puddle of tears, you know. And again, I'm not saying that in a judgmental way of myself. I think it was more of just like that time in my life that it was an intense moment. So self-compassion begets compassion. And compassionate parenting has been studied and found to promote caring and nurturing family environments. Reducing mood and behavioral problems in children, increasing sensitivity and empathy, and improving relational connectivity. According to Stephen Sosny, compassionate parenting also allows for us to better be able to listen to our children. In all stages of development, children report that parents yell too much and listen too little. I'm sure my kids would say that. They were that compassionate parenting also helps us to respond to our children's positive emotions as well as their negative emotions. To be able to openly express affection to our children and to other adults in the family, to enjoy them. That fun strengthens bonds between people, and to be able to learn from them. And aren't these all things that we want for our households and our children? So when we're self-compassionate, it increases, again, our ability to be able to be compassionate as parents. So recently, a study by an Australian researcher, James Kirby, took 60 parents and divided them up into two groups. Most of them were moms in their 30s. And he had one group do a loving kindness meditation, and then another group did a focused imagery recording. And so basically what these two are is, one of them is like a meditation that's geared towards tuning into yourself, expressing love and tenderness towards yourself. And the other one was maybe like a guided imagery of something like looking at a nice relaxing picture or something like that. So before and after listening to these recordings, the parents completed questionnaires both on self-compassion and being compassionately motivated, like, to their children. And they provided their emotional responses to like common parenting scenarios, again, like a child crying and insisting for a candy bar at the store, something we've all probably dealt with. The results were that the parents in the loving kindness meditation group were more self-compassionate, were more calm, were more sympathetic. They were less angry and frustrated compared to the other group. So he's suggesting that from this study that doing things like a loving kindness meditation, which would be an exercise that we're going to talk about, that could be something you would do as a self-compassion practice, can help to support parents' well-being, can increase our capacity to be less reactive in responding to our child's distress, being able to, again, be more compassionate to our child, and just being able to cope with more day-to-day stress. And again, I think this is something that we all could benefit from. So now we're going to get down to the part of, so how do I do this? Maybe I've convinced you that this is a good idea. And self-compassion isn't just about telling yourself nice things or telling yourself the things you want to hear. It's really about transforming the lens in which you see yourself, and that it's through the lens of kindness and true compassion. It's not trying to suppress our pain or make it go away. That's still denial and avoidance. It's really about inviting that in, recognizing that, honoring that is part of what's happening in your life and what's going on for you. And again, this is not something that's gonna be a direct path. It's gonna be something that you're gonna get down and get perfected. It's something that will be always a work in progress. So it's important to remember to be offering yourself forgiveness and grace as you go along the way. So next on your handout, then on the upper right box, we're going to talk about some of the ways that you can practice self-compassion. And again, I think it's really important to start with the fact that before you kind of do anything, it's really about the mindset. It starts with our awareness that as humans, that we are all flawed and broken, that we all experience pain and suffering, and that we're also able to, to respond to that in different ways. And so we believe that life is hard, that pain is inevitable for all of us, and that we are imperfect and that we're going to make mistakes. So when we operate from that mindset, we can begin with an acceptance rather than a rejection stance. And I think that's really like what's undergirding and what's fundamental about this whole practice or idea of self-compassion. So going back to Kristen Neff, she says, we can't always get what we want. Darn it, right? We can't always be who we want to be. Another point of limitation or acceptance. So when this reality is denied or resisted, suffering arises in the form of stress, frustration or self-criticism. But when we accept the reality with benevolence, then we can generate positive emotions of kindness that can help us to cope with that. So again, the essence of when we can accept those things about life or about ourselves, we start from the place of being able to give, not rejecting. So giving ourselves permission to be imperfect. Again, this idea that we're going to make mistakes, we are human, that this doesn't mean taking a fatalistic view of ourselves. Well, oh, I'm just going to, mess that up, or it's, oh, well, it's not kind of taking that kind of approach. It's just giving yourself permission that, things aren't going to maybe always match expectations, or there are going to be times that you're going to not do something the way that you want to, or there's maybe, pieces of our body or, other aspects that we need to accept. And again, like one of the ways of being able to kind of see where these places are in our lives is oftentimes the places where we might be critical or judgmental of somebody else. Oftentimes when we flip that around, we can take a look and say, gosh, that's probably an area of myself that I struggle with, and so it's easier for me to be critical of somebody else. Maybe I'm struggling with, some kind of aspect of something, but I don't want to see it in myself, but I can easily find it out, notice it in everybody else. So that's, again, that piece of awareness. So one of the things that is fun to do is kind of giving yourself a permission slip. And this may be something that you write down on a Post-it, or you actually kind of give yourself a permission slip to make a mistake, or to maybe not be the parent that you thought you were going to be, but you giving yourself permission to be the parent that you are. And again, we're looking at ourselves, and sometimes we may need to also look at our child or our parenting situation and say, I'm going to give us permission to be who we are and not who I thought we were going to be, or I wanted us to be, or I wanted parenting to look like, but being able to give ourselves permission for that. Weeding out self-criticism and judgment. And again, this is a piece that begins with awareness. When it's happening, it's not about beating ourselves up about that criticism. That's kind of, doing the opposite, but rather taking time to acknowledge, what that's really about, the pain maybe that's behind that, and respond to that place with kindness and love. Similar to that is kind of making peace with your inner critic. Maybe you need to spend some time writing down, taking note of what does your inner critic say, when you're going throughout your day. What's the tone that you have with yourself? What's the what are the words that you use? How do you sound? Sometimes, oftentimes when I'm working with clients, when we do this kind of work, I'll have them write out the messages that they tell themselves. And often I'll say, does this sound like anybody that you know? And unfortunately, a lot of times it's a parent. And so the most thing that I'm constantly reminded of when I'm working with clients is that I am shaping my children's future. I am shaping the things that are the foundations that are being laid in what I say, by how I talk to them, all of those things. And so that's kind of a double check of how we're talking to ourselves. And maybe we had a parent that was overly harsh or critical with us. But then also being able to see, how are we speaking to our children? And really evaluating that and saying, would I say these things to a friend? If a friend told me, same situation that I was going through, would I respond to them in the way that I respond to myself? And often, shockingly, it's no. That we wouldn't ever say those kind of things. So that's a good way to kind of look at our inner critic and see where they're at, and then also looking at how do we reframe those things? How can we begin to speak to ourselves in a different tone, in a different way, with more through the lens of kindness? Journaling and creativity. This is always a great way. Brene Brown likes to say we move what we know from our head to our hand, from our head to our heart through our hands. And again, it's this idea of how do we embed knowledge? It's often through the act of doing, and that's why I always like to have things that are kind of interactive and engaging. When we just kind of keep it up in our minds, it may not take as much form or shape as when we do it. So journaling, using art, using creativity, and maybe if something jumps out at you tonight, maybe you go home and you make some art about it. Maybe if it's inner critic, what is that person? If that was a character, what would they look like? What do you want your inner critic to look like? Maybe you'd rename it, and it wouldn't even be a critic anymore. It'd be an inner confidant. But those are the ways that creativity or journaling can be really helpful. The other thing that I love about that is that we get it out on the page, and then we get it externalized from us, and then we can see it and we can engage with it, and we can respond to it in a different way than when it's just kind of in our head and inside of us. So again, the loving kindness meditations, I've kind of highlighted that with the study that they did in Australia, and this could be just building in times for quiet stillness, for just slowing things down, really getting engaged in yourself, and again, like be observant without judgment of how you're feeling, how your body feels, how your emotions are, your thoughts, everything that's kind of going on. And this could be in the form of a meditation, a prayer, or just being quiet, being able to develop this rhythm, that this becomes a practice in your life. So there's a lot of great guided meditations that you can find online. And I just recommend that if this is something that really speaks to you, to try a few out. Sometimes there's a lot of things out there with apps and YouTube and stuff, and some of them might you might find your mind wandering and making your shopping list, and so maybe you need to find something else that maybe feels different, or sometimes they might sound too cheesy for you, whatever it is. But try a few until you find something, if you want to have that kind of led meditation. But I think it can be a good way to have another voice kind of guiding you in a direction of those self-reflective thoughts. Sometimes it's hard for us to kind of sit in silence on our own and keep ourselves focused and be able to do that. And so it's nice to have some outside voice kind of guiding us through that. Finding supportive people. Woodrow Wilson, one of our former presidents, said, "Your enlightenment depends on the company you keep." And I think it's really important that we surround ourselves with people that lift us up and that support us. Finding individuals who are also willing to be vulnerable, to admit their maybe shortcomings and their vulnerabilities, and want to encourage you in your desire to grow and develop it too. It's being aware of also relationships that might cause you to feel negative about yourself. Sometimes you might come away from a situation and you see this person in different capacities, and you always feel negative about yourself. Maybe you just feel like, ugh, I just feel so slimed when I'm around that person. Maybe you need to think about boundaries, different boundaries with that person, or changing the dynamic and the relationship if that's possible. Expressing gratitude. I think what goes hand in hand with kindness and compassion is gratitude. So when we're able to express gratitude for the aspects of ourselves and our lives that we are grateful for, then we are able to kind of foster more of that acceptance and love towards ourselves. So now I want you to take another moment to, in that last box there, maybe just some things that have spoken to you tonight, some ways that you might want to commit to yourself to begin on this journey, or maybe you've already been on it, so maybe enhance that, this journey of self-compassion. And we can kind of continue the dialogue, but I just wanted to mention that I have an upcoming group for the mom support, sorry, Dad. But it's basically a 7-week parenting support for moms that are raising gifted and emotionally intense kids. And the date is it's going to be Fridays and from 11:30 to 1, probably beginning soon. As soon as I kind of have a consensus, then we'll hit go. But that's kind of the time that's been set aside. So if you're interested, or if you know of somebody, please pass the resource along. But thank you. It's been wonderful speaking to you tonight, and be happy to talk more or answer any questions. And but I hope that this began a dialogue about this, and again, just to be able to kind of to nurture ourselves, to say we matter too as parents. And it's really important that we're filling our wells. And then one more thing, I wanted to mention that if you go to the website, the first website that's listed on your handout to go deeper, selfcompassion.org, that's Kristen Neff's site. And you can take a little quick, 20-question inventory, and it'll give you a little rating of like different scales of how you're doing on self-compassion and isolation and some of the other factors. So. That's a good way to kind of monitor yourself and see if your score changes over time or not. It's a good place to start. And then there's a lot of great exercises and meditations and stuff that you can listen to on that site. Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll just do a quick exit.
Yes.
So thank you for clearly defining what self-compassion means, and also providing such concrete ways for our parents to practice it. The next gifted support group meeting is going to be on October 22nd, and that's really focused more on the high schoolers. So Dr. Stephen Mercier will be talking about 3 rules for applying to college. In fact, it's actually open for middle and high school students, so for them to just come and learn as well. So thank you so much for being here this evening, and we'll see you next month.